I've sat with this story for years because I never really knew what category it belonged in. Confession? Regret? One of those things you tell yourself was survival until enough time passes and you realize survival and greed sometimes wear the same face. Anyway, I'm William. I used to work around people who talked like sharks in expensive shoes. Not rich people, people trying very hard to become rich. There's a difference. Rich people are calm. These guys practically vibrated. Every conversation was about leverage, margins, opportunities, and how rules were just obstacles for people who lacked imagination. One afternoon I heard a man say something that lodged itself in my head. A straw client is a deal with a predetermined outcome. Everyone at the table laughed. I laughed too, even though I barely understood what he meant at the time. Back then I was 28, permanently behind on bills, living in an apartment where the pipes made noises like someone knocking from inside the walls. I'd wake up already stressed. I'd check my bank account before brushing my teeth because I needed to know what kind of day I was allowed to have. People like to imagine criminals start as monsters. I didn't. I started as a tired guy who was angry at everyone who seemed to be winning. I told myself I wasn't jealous. I absolutely was. And the dangerous thing wasn't the money problems. It was that little shift happening in my head. I stopped asking, "Is this wrong?" I started asking, "How wrong is it exactly?" That was the beginning. Not the crime itself. Just the first crack. A few weeks after hearing that line, I started noticing things I'd ignored before. Certain people never signed documents themselves. Certain names appeared once and vanished. Conversations would stop the second someone outside the circle walked into the room. Nobody ever said, "We're committing fraud." People rarely do. They wrap ugly things in clean language until they sound harmless. I was working contract jobs then, paperwork, errands, random office tasks. I wasn't important. I was invisible, which turned out to be its own kind of education. Invisible people hear everything. The thing that kept gnawing at me was how unfair it all felt. I was counting coins to buy groceries while guys wearing watches worth more than my car joked about. Creative arrangements. I started thinking something I'm embarrassed to admit now. If everyone around me was already bending rules, maybe rules weren't real. That thought scared me a little. Not enough, though. Not nearly enough. The first time I got pulled closer to it wasn't dramatic at all. No secret meeting. No envelope of cash sliding across a table. It happened over coffee in a place with sticky tables and burnt espresso. A guy I knew from work, not exactly a friend, more like one of those people who orbit your life, sat across from me and started complaining about paperwork and unreliable people. Then he looked at me and said, almost casually, "You ever notice some people get paid just for being a name on paper?" I laughed because I thought it was a joke. He didn't. He started talking in circles after that. Temporary arrangements. Harmless signatures. Nobody gets hurt. Every sentence sounded polished, rehearsed like he'd said it before. I remember feeling two things at once, curiosity and this uncomfortable pressure in my chest. Because deep down I already knew something. I wasn't listening because I was shocked. I was listening because I was interested. I wish I could tell you I immediately shut it down. That I stood up, threw cash on the table, and said something dramatic about integrity. That isn't what happened. I went home and spent the whole night replaying the conversation. I kept doing math in my head, overdue rent, credit card balances, the loan I kept pretending I'd handle next month. I stared at my apartment ceiling and listened to pipes clank behind the walls. People imagine temptation as excitement. For me it felt quieter than that. It felt practical. That's what made it dangerous. I started building arguments for myself. Maybe it's not serious. Maybe it's technically dishonest but not really harmful. Maybe I'm just helping with paperwork. I was acting like both prosecutor and defense attorney inside my own head, and strangely, the defense kept winning. The worst part? By then I wasn't asking whether I'd do it. I had started wondering what my role would be. A few days later I met him again, and this time there wasn't much dancing around the subject. He explained just enough for me to understand the shape of it without giving me every moving part. Names on forms. People standing where someone else didn't want to stand. Layers between actions and consequences. I remember sitting there pretending to think carefully while my mind had already sprinted ahead. I should be honest about that. People like to rewrite their own stories and place giant warning signs before every bad decision. Mine didn't feel like that. Mine felt like drifting a few feet at a time until I suddenly looked around and realized I was nowhere near where I started. He asked if I was interested. Not would I commit a crime? Not would I help deceive people? Just interested? Funny how a single word can hide an entire disaster. I looked down at my coffee for a second. Then I said, maybe. That maybe changed the atmosphere immediately. It was subtle, but I felt it. Before that, I'd been an outsider listening to rumors. After I said it, I was suddenly being looked at differently, like I'd stepped through a doorway without noticing. Over the next week, I got calls and messages that sounded strangely ordinary. Meet here. Grab lunch. Talk later. Nothing dramatic. If somebody had looked at my schedule, they would have seen the most boring week imaginable. But inside my head, things had become loud. I kept telling myself I still had control. I could leave any time. I could say no at the last second. I repeated that so often it became a ritual. That's another thing I learned later. People love imaginary exits. You tell yourself there's always a door behind you. Then one day you turn around and realize you passed it miles back. And somewhere beneath all my nervousness, beneath the guilt and hesitation, there was another feeling I hated admitting. I was excited. Preparation started without anyone calling it preparation. Nobody handed me a checklist or sat me down under a hanging light bulb like some movie scene. Instead, people started feeding me little pieces of information, little expectations. Dress a certain way. Be available at certain times. Remember names. Remember dates. Normal things. That was the trick. Everything felt so ordinary that my brain kept trying to classify it as harmless. I even caught myself becoming weirdly professional about it. I bought a notebook and started organizing reminders, then immediately felt sick after doing it. I remember staring at that notebook on my kitchen table. Because that was the moment where reality pushed through all my excuses. I wasn't standing near something bad anymore. I was preparing for it. I closed the notebook and told myself I should walk away. I actually stood up with every intention of making that phone call. Then my phone buzzed. A message. Everything still good for Friday? And I froze. I stared at that message for a long time. Longer than I want to admit. It's strange what your brain does when you're scared. You expect some dramatic moral battle, thunder in the distance, conscience screaming at you. Mine felt smaller. I sat on my couch holding my phone and started negotiating with myself. You can still leave after Friday. You're just seeing what this is. You haven't actually done anything. I must have repeated those lines 20 times. Friday started to feel less like a choice and more like weather. Something coming whether I wanted it or not. I went to work, nodded through conversations, answered emails, pretended to care about deadlines. Meanwhile, there was this constant pressure behind my ribs. That night I barely slept. I remember checking the clock over and over, 1:13, 2:47, 4:02. Every time I woke up I had the same thought. If I'm this nervous before it even starts, what does that say about me? Friday arrived with that weird kind of normal morning that almost makes you angry. The sun was out. People were walking dogs, carrying coffee cups, arguing about traffic. The world looked exactly the same while mine felt like it had shifted a few inches off center. I remember getting dressed and changing shirts 3 times for no real reason. Everything felt wrong. Too formal. Too casual. Too obvious. I was acting like clothing could somehow hide what was happening inside my head. By then my stomach was in knots. When I got there, Everybody else looked calm. That hit me harder than anything. They talked casually, checked their phones, joked about random things. No one looked nervous enough for the situation I had built into a disaster inside my mind. For a few minutes I actually felt relieved. Then I had a different thought. Either I'm overreacting, or they've done this enough times that it stopped affecting them. And somehow that thought scared me more. The moment things actually started, my body reacted before my brain did. My mouth went dry. My hands felt cold. I remember trying to keep my face neutral because I suddenly became convinced everyone around me could see exactly what I was thinking. It's funny what panic chooses to focus on. I wasn't thinking about prison or consequences yet. I was thinking about stupid things. Whether I looked suspicious. Whether I was standing strangely. Whether my voice sounded different. I kept expecting someone to stop everything. I imagined a person pointing at me and saying, "Wait a second." Nobody did. People moved around, conversations continued, phones rang somewhere in the background. The world stayed painfully ordinary. And that almost relaxed me. Almost. Because then one small thing happened that none of us expected. I noticed somebody looking at me for a little too long. Maybe 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Not long enough to matter. Long enough for my heart to slam into my ribs anyway. I know how irrational this sounds now, but that look felt like a spotlight. The guy probably glanced at me for a completely normal reason, but once fear gets into your system it starts manufacturing evidence. Suddenly every movement around me felt connected. 2 people whispering? About me. Someone checking paperwork twice? About me. A person walking past and barely making eye contact? Definitely about me. My pulse was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I kept forcing myself to breathe normally because I thought if I looked nervous, I'd become nervous in some visible, undeniable way. Then the guy walked over. I remember every detail of those few seconds. The sound of footsteps. The pressure in my chest. The absurd thought that my legs suddenly felt weak. He stopped next to me. And smiled. Then he asked me something completely ordinary. I answered automatically, but I barely heard my own voice. Because even after he walked away, the panic stayed. It had already moved in. After that, I stopped feeling like a participant, and started feeling like someone watching himself from outside his own body. You ever have those moments where reality goes slightly blurry and your brain starts narrating everything? That happened to me. I remember thinking, look at you. Look at what you're doing. I'd spent weeks building explanations for myself. Temporary arrangement. Easy money. Harmless paperwork. But standing there, with adrenaline flooding through me, all those carefully constructed excuses suddenly sounded cheap. Because my body knew something before my mind admitted it. I knew I was doing something wrong. Not technically wrong. Not morally complicated. Wrong. The strange thing is I didn't leave. Fear should have pushed me out the door, but it didn't. Fear and momentum mixed together into something else entirely. I just kept moving because everyone else kept moving. And once you start following the current, stopping feels like swimming upstream in concrete shoes. The thing nobody tells you about crossing a line is that the world doesn't suddenly change around you afterward. There's no alarm. No dramatic music. No invisible judge descending from the sky. Things ended. People shook hands. Chairs moved. Conversations shifted toward weekend plans and traffic and food. The ordinary world returned so fast it felt unreal. And for a few minutes, I actually felt something close to relief. Then my phone rang. I looked at the screen and felt my stomach drop. It was my younger sister. I answered, trying to sound normal, and she immediately asked if I was okay. Not because she knew anything, she didn't. She just said I sounded tired lately. That hit me harder than panic had. Because while strangers saw nothing unusual, someone who knew me could hear something changing through a phone call. I remember staring out a window afterward thinking, Maybe I'm not hiding this nearly as well as I think I am. The days afterward were worse than the actual event. During it, adrenaline keeps you occupied. Your brain narrows everything into tiny tasks and immediate problems. Afterward, there's space. Space is dangerous. I started replaying every conversation in my head. Did I say something strange? Did I hesitate too long somewhere? Did somebody notice how nervous I looked? I'd be standing in line at a grocery store and suddenly remember a random expression on somebody's face from that day. Then I'd convince myself it meant something. I was building investigations that didn't exist. And because guilt has a weird sense of humor, the money, the thing that had seemed so important before, suddenly felt smaller. I'd look at it and think, this is what I traded my peace of mind for. I slept badly, ate badly, jumped whenever unknown numbers called me. I kept waiting for consequences to arrive. And eventually I realized something disturbing. Even if nobody came for me, something already had doubt I wasn't caught in the dramatic way people imagine. No doors kicked in. No detective sitting across from me under fluorescent lights. Life just kept moving forward. But I carried something out of that situation that stayed with me much longer than fear ever did. I carried the realization that I had spent months believing I was different from people I judged. I thought bad decisions belonged to other kinds of people. More selfish people. Colder people. Then I watched myself build excuses one brick at a time until I could comfortably stand on top of them. That was the part that changed me. If anybody reading this expects a lesson wrapped up neatly with some inspirational quote, I don't really have one. I just have a warning. Most people don't sprint toward terrible decisions. They drift. A compromise here. A justification there. One maybe, that turns into another. Pay attention to the stories you tell yourself. Because eventually you start believing them. And once that happens, you stop noticing where the road changed.